It's now my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Congressman Patrick Murphy, candidate for U.S. Senate. No stranger to many in this room, Patrick Murphy represents Florida's 18th Congressional District, which includes northern Palm Beach, Martin, and St. Lucie counties. He's a native Floridian who grew up along the South Florida coast. Congressman Murphy attended the University of Miami, where he received a degree in business administration before joining Deloitte & Touche. He is currently one of only 9 CPAs serving in the House of Representatives. Before being elected to Congress in 2013, at the age of 29, Patrick started Coastal Environmental Services, one of the many companies who assisted in the cleanup after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And in Congress, he has similarly been recognized for his efforts to protect our environment. Patrick currently serves on the House Committee on Financial Services and the House Select Committee on Intelligence. He is also the co-founder and co-chairman of the United Solutions Caucus, a bipartisan group of freshmen and sophomore lawmakers dedicated to working together to move our economy forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Congressman Patrick Murphy.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Tony, thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you for that great introduction. Thank all of you, all the leadership here, all of your support. It's great to be back here. And man, you know it's a bad election cycle when we are praying for this thing to end. Thank you for the prayer. I feel the pain. I feel you. I'm ready for this. 6 days to go. I'm sure you all are ready for these ads to finish. I do want to give a couple special shout-outs, of course, to all the elected officials, all the community leaders, but certainly the folks that I serve with on a day-to-day basis. Ted Deutsch and Lois Frankel, thank you. I also want to give a shout out to Randy Perkins, who I know is going to make a great member of Congress. Keep protecting our environment. And Tony, you were exactly right. You know, I'm actually more concerned with the 2 questions I'm getting from these students than any debate I had with Marco Rubio. I'm looking forward to all the questions here. And Tony, you know, in your introduction, you mentioned the United Solutions Caucus. And that was a bipartisan group I started when I was first elected to the Congress. And the reason I say that was because the last time I spoke here, I was with David Joyce, a freshman at the time, Republican from Ohio. And we sat here and sort of had dueling stories about our first couple months in the Congress. And that, you know, spirit of trying to get things done, that spirit of bipartisanship. And it's hard to believe that 4 years has passed since that time, but that same message of trying to reach across the aisle to solve problems is as true now as it was then. And in fact, that's a big part of why I've decided to run for the U.S. Senate. I've enjoyed my first 4 years and 2 terms in the Congress, proud of what we've been able to achieve together as a community, but quite frankly believe we can get a lot more done together by being in the U.S. Senate. And the challenges we face, you know, as a nation are only getting tougher. And I had a heck of a wake-up call when I was first elected. I think Ted and Lois have probably heard me tell this story. You see, I get elected to the Congress, and I'm excited. You know, I got a new suit on, and, you know, they got these, you know, elevators for the members of Congress to go down and go vote, and you go in these tunnels, and I'm there. I don't know anybody, really. You got these little pins you wear, little round, say you're a member of Congress. So here I am in the elevator, I don't know, second week or so. I'm on my way to go vote. Another gentleman walks in the elevator with a little pin on. Hey, how you doing, sir? I'm Patrick Murphy. I'm from Florida. Extend my hand. He kind of sits there like this. Okay, he didn't hear me. Okay, fine. How you doing? I'm Patrick. Still nothing. And I'm like, what's going on? I wear deodorant, like he won't shake my hand. And I'm thinking to myself, he clearly heard me. He clearly decided not to shake my hand. So that's kind of weird. So anyway, I go vote, and I'm thinking about it. I get back to my office. I got this book of members of Congress, and I'm flipping through, trying to see who it was. Turns out he was best friends with Alan West, the individual I defeated. And he wouldn't shake my hand, right? And I tell that story, you know, it's sad, but it's funny. But You think about that for a second. Think of any of you in your lives, in your businesses, in your careers, in your families, anything you've done in life to have that sort of personality, that sort of hatred, right? That you wouldn't even shake somebody's hand that you don't even know. Can you imagine how tough it is to get things done in Washington, D.C. when that is the mentality of so many folks up there? Now, I'm not saying the U.S. Senate is perfect, right? But I do believe there are more opportunities to reach across the aisle and find some middle ground and actually get things done. And I think the challenges that we face as a nation right now are only getting tougher. Think of these cell phones we all carry around and have with us, right? Think about what technology is doing, how it's changing so many of our lives. Automation and globalization. Some call it the Uberization of our economy. Many studies have shown that about 50% of the jobs we have today will not be there for the next generation because of computerization. Right? Think of how many new jobs are going to have to change. And I believe if we are going to be serious about addressing this concern, this disappearing middle class and income inequality and the challenges that technology has thrown into the mix, we better get really serious about education. Right? And that starts off with investing more. From pre-K to PhD programs. They say about 80% of brain development happens in those first 4 to 5 years. Right? Why in the world aren't we investing more in early education and ensuring that there is quality and affordable education regardless of what neighborhood you come from? Right? There shouldn't be a difference in quality of education based on where you're born. Right? Let's invest more there. Let's make sure that our teachers are getting paid more. Let's make sure they have the supplies that they need. Right, that they're in classrooms that they're proud of. I was with some teachers from Palm Beach County, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago. They were in D.C. and came to visit and talking to them about, their day-to-day. They explained that they make on average $48,000 to $52,000 a year, and they're each spending about $1,000 out of their pocket on supplies, markers and crayons, pens, etc., for their kids that come without the necessary supplies. And if that's not bad enough, they explained to me the troubles they face and the challenges the students are facing. Because these kids in Palm Beach County now, right, one of the more affluent communities in the whole country, the books that they're reading are so dirty, right, marked up, graffiti, and so banged up that they can't read them often. So the teachers are getting together on weekends, getting razor blades, cutting out the clean pages, rebinding books, and then dispersing them to the kids. But then there's not enough to go around, so the kids have to rotate books on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday schedule. Think about that. In the United States of America, in Palm Beach County, our kids don't have school books every night. Just the fact that they don't have computers and laptops and tablets, they are already falling behind. So we better start investing more there. We also have to make sure that education is more efficient, right? There are opportunities to use technology to our advantage, to make sure we're getting more quality education, that there is a new minimum standard of quality for education. And I'm sure we all went to school or played sports and know folks very well that probably didn't want to go on to higher education, didn't want to go on a 4-year degree. There's nothing wrong with vocational schools. Let's start investing more in vocational schools and trades for folks that want to work with their hands. Let's make sure that folks that do want to go on to get higher education aren't strapped with tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. Right? We are setting back an entire generation right now with debt. If elected to the Senate, I would be the first millennial to serve there. This could be the first generation as well. That is well behind their parents and grandparents because of that student debt. I'm sure there's plenty of folks in here that, had that first loan, bought that first house early on, and they were able to do it because they didn't have $50,000 of, college debt. But imagine the kids that do now, right? They are stuck paying those debts for generations, for decades. We have to, number one, make sure that college is more affordable. We have to make sure that students with college debt can refinance at today's historically low rates. And we can do that. We can make progress there. I also believe that if we're going to be serious about addressing income inequality in this country, we better address tax reform. And this is where everyone falls asleep. I know, I get it. But I'll try to be quick on it, but it is important. If elected to the U.S. Senate, I would be the second CPA in the history of our country to serve there. that explain a lot with our deficit? I don't know, maybe just a little bit. But we, I believe, need a tax code that is more fair, a tax code that is more simple and more fair for more individuals, not just domestically, but internationally. Because the difference between the pass-throughs, the S-corps and the partnerships, and the C-corps is huge in our country right now, what the effective tax rate is, but also the difference internationally. And I don't believe that we need to be the lowest tax rate in the whole world. We just got to be in the ballpark. So I support a plan that actually gets rid of a lot of the loopholes, a lot of deductions, exemptions, but brings taxes down to 20 to 25%. More fair, simple tax code that makes sure we are competitive. And I believe that we can do more to create an environment of certainty and predictability that will ultimately help our economy, help reduce these deficits, if we can ensure that we have a regulatory environment that's predictable. You know, we always get in this fight, Republicans and Democrats, of, too much regulation and not enough regulation. It shouldn't be about that. It should be smarter regulations, right? Tailored to the business, tailored to the problem. We have tens of thousands of pages of regulations on the books now from the 1950s and 60s. Have nothing to do with the world today. We can make our regulatory agencies a lot more efficient as well. And we can do that. You just got to be willing to have a conversation about how to improve these programs. Right? Great example, Sarbanes-Oxley. As an auditor at Deloitte, spent years looking at Sarbanes-Oxley. We had to do something after WorldCom and Enron. Right? But what was intended versus what got implemented were two very different things. Right? And you could probably say the same thing about Dodd-Frank. Right? There are so many pieces of regulations and legislation in Washington, D.C. that pass that have to continually be worked on and improved. You see, I believe that Dodd-Frank was a good step forward, did a lot to rein in some of the abuses on Wall Street. But there were unintended consequences that are affecting the small businesses, right? It's affecting the small banks, the community banks, the credit unions. We got to make sure that we're not hampering those small banks. I saw an interesting stat not too long ago that the big banks, top 4 or 5 banks, have about 40% more market share since Dodd-Frank passed, and there's been 3 new bank charters since it passed. Right? Think of that, gone from about 12,000 banks down to 6,500. Right? I believe we got to have more small banks because ultimately that access to capital is so important for the small businesses, right? For those entrepreneurs, for that American engine where folks have access to a couple bucks for that great idea. And we cannot, hamper that anymore. So we need smarter regulations. Another great example is the Affordable Care Act. Right? It was a huge step forward for this country. 20 million people now have access to health care. But there's things that need to be fixed. If the president himself was standing here, he would tell you all there's things I want to have fixed. Right? So instead of having this, constant debate where some people say, no, it's perfect, don't touch it. You got other people saying it's entirely broken, throw the whole thing out. Let's find the middle ground. We better get health care right in our country. It could be what bankrupts us if we don't get it right. So let's have an honest conversation about how we bend that cost curve. Right? How we make sure more people have access to affordable health care. Expanding Medicaid, for example. 900,000 people in Florida alone would have access to it. Making sure that the government's allowed to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies, right? Help bring down the costs, right? And these are common sense things, I believe that we can do simply by working together and finding that common ground. And another area I think that's critical that we need to be looking at and will continue to be critical to me if elected to the U.S. Senate is investing more in our infrastructure. They say there's about $2.5 trillion offshore right now. Some of the largest corporations, largest businesses and wealthiest individuals have their money offshore. 2.5 trillion. Why in the world aren't we repatriating that money? Right? Let's pick a number to bring that money back, investing it solely in infrastructure, roads and bridges and schools, IT infrastructure. Lois Frankel's been passionate about investing in our ports, as we should be. Right, the expansion of the Panama Canal. Florida is in a great location to take advantage of that. We should be investing more in our ports. We should have the best ports in the world. Let's use some of that money that's offshore and bring it back. Let's also consider thinking big for once. Interest rates are at historically low rates right now. Right? Let's have a new deal. Unfortunately, you look at Washington, D.C., you turn on the TV, you read the newspaper. Everything we talk about nowadays is, 6-month, budgets. 1-year budgets. We can hardly even pass a budget. anymore, right? 2-year increments. We're living in this constant cycle, this treadmill of politics. We've got to go back to the days where we're thinking in 25, 30, 50-year increments, where we have a vision not just for us, but our kids and our grandkids, where we're willing to make those investments, the investments that have a return on investment, where there is good ROI in education and infrastructure. Imagine where this country would be right now if we didn't build the interstate highway system, if we didn't have vision to build big airports and IT infrastructure. Right? Those are investments that actually make sense, that are going to come back in droves to help our economy and help future generations and make sure that America stays the strongest and the best economy in the whole world. But again, you got to be able to find that middle ground. And speaking of infrastructure, on a topic that I care a lot about, I think everyone in this room does, is the Everglades. Right? Think of how important the Everglades is, what a precious part of our environment it is. Thanks to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, it became apparent just how important the Everglades is. And there's always finger pointing and blame to go around for the situation we're in now. And if you want to be honest with where we're really at and what happened, look back 80, 100 years to the Army Corps of Engineers who actually re-irrigated the Everglades. Right? That's what really happened. And I believe we must continually make steps, incremental steps, to help restore Mother Nature's natural flow. From Orlando down through Kissimmee, all the way down south to the Keys to make sure that flow of water continues to move. And it's not going to happen overnight, but we're making progress. Right? Proud of the work I've been doing with my colleagues in the House on both sides of the aisle to help authorize nearly $2 billion of funding for the Everglades. Right? Making sure that we are moving forward with C-43 and C-44, large water retention areas, helping our estuaries. The Indian River Lagoon, just north of us, is the most biologically diverse estuary in the whole country. Right? Over 4,000 species are there. Yet it's being polluted. You've all seen the algae blooms and what's happening. That's in our backyard. We can do more to invest to prevent that from happening. And even if you're not as passionate about the environment as I am, you should care about our economy. Right? Think of how many jobs are tied to our environment. Right? Everywhere I go in the state of Florida, see the very real impacts of climate change and how it's impacting businesses. Right? You go down to the Florida Keys, charter boat fishermen going out of business because the reefs are dying from acidification and bleaching. Right? That charter boat fisherman goes out of business. What happens to the marina? What happens to the restaurant there? What happens to the dive master? The real estate values, right? It's all connected. Right? You go to Miami Beach. I was there a couple weeks ago. Sunny day, driving down Miami Beach, right? 2-3 inches of salt water on the roads. Right? The sunny day flooding. Right? Those roads were not built underwater. Right? Things are changing. We got to address it. Right? The algae crisis in our district on the west coast of Florida. You look at the oysters dying in the Panhandle. Everywhere I go in the state of Florida, see the very real impacts of climate change. And something we should all be talking about and thinking about, especially in South Florida, is the impact of climate change, the Everglades, and our drinking water. You see, that natural flow of fresh water from the Everglades used to flow south, down, replenish our aquifers. And that flow of water would act as a natural barrier to the salt water. Because South Florida, as you know, is all limestone. It's like a giant sponge. So as salt water levels are rising, the water is moving quicker inland. So we are seeing fresh water, historically wells, aquifers, being poisoned now because of salt water. That is no longer being held back because that fresh water isn't flowing south anymore. So there's some real ramifications here of what we've done to our environment that are going to affect so many of us, so many of our businesses, so many of our lives. So we got to do more to address it. Climate change is something we can do more to address, right? We can invest more in renewable energy. We can invest more to make sure we're getting off this addiction to fossil fuels. And the quicker we do that, the quicker we're investing in solar, wind, thermal, tidal, et cetera, the better off we're going to be as a nation, the stronger we're going to be. If we don't have to pay for that oil, then that means we can invest in education and training, right? Whatever it might be. That makes us stronger. So I believe we can do that. And we have a lot of people in Washington, D.C. that continue to deny climate change is even happening. Deny science completely. Right, come on. We can do better than that as a country. We got to look at science. And you don't even need to be a scientist. In many cases, you can look out your window to see the effects of climate change. And another issue that I care a lot about, and I think everybody in this room does, and something I've spent a lot of time focused on, is national security. And as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, this is something we spend a lot of time on. And one of the interesting takeaways I'll mention to start off here is on that Intel Committee, there is very little partisanship. Because it's amazing what happens all of a sudden when you don't have cameras, when you don't have press, you don't have cell phones in a room. Right? All of a sudden, people start getting along. Right? What's that great quote from President Truman? It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Right? And all of a sudden, people start getting along in the Intel Committee. Every day, we're passing legislation. We're making progress. We have very real threats, and we can get it done. So in the Intel Committee, there's a lot that I think we all read about to some extent, but a lot that we better really make the investments necessary to protect this country. Starting off with cybersecurity. I mentioned cell phones and technology earlier. Think about how all of our lives have changed just in the past 5 years alone with technology. You know, how we're so much more connected nowadays. And it's not just us as humans. It's not just our contacts and pictures. It's the military, right? It's our universities. It's businesses. So much of what we do now is connected. And unfortunately, our adversaries know that's a weak point. And it doesn't take nearly the investments that it used to affect that cyber. And it's a lot easier to be on offense than it is on defense. So as much as we're starting to invest in our military and new pieces of equipment, I believe we better be equally concerned with the investments we're making in cyber, with our satellites, with our communications, because that is a vulnerability. And we better take that very seriously. I also believe that we need to crack down more on terrorism. We never should have let ISIS grow this big. We must go after them where they're at. We cannot allow these strongholds to form anywhere in the world, right? These vacuums. We also must be serious about what we're doing in our homeland to go after these lone wolf attacks. You know, right? Using our offensive capabilities to track them down. Working with our allies. Better coordination. Part of that is cyber, and part of that is finding the balance of privacy. But we can do more to protect our country. And we cannot forget the more traditional threats we face, like nuclear. Whether that's in North Korea, or that's in Pakistan, whether that's Russia. Right? We better take these threats very seriously. And again, that's going to involve working with our allies, better information sharing, better coordination, and making sure that America stays the number one, security, the number one national security, the number one toughest military in the whole world. And we can do that. We can make the investments necessary to protect our country, making sure we're working with our greatest ally, Israel, to make sure she has everything she needs to protect herself. Right? We must continue to build those alliances around the world. And I mentioned Lois and what she's been doing on ports. And, I always have this joke with my buddy Ted Deutsch where any issue he has with Ireland, he comes to me on. But any issue I have with Israel, I go to Ted Deutsch on. But I have some great colleagues in the House. I've made some great friendships and look forward to continuing to work together with them in the U.S. Senate, if elected. And one of the things I want to close by saying, because it's certainly, I think, topical with this election and all the gridlock that we're seeing, and I think my colleagues would agree, that there are several things that have happened in our political process over the past several years, decades even, that have led to this extreme gridlock we have, right? Starting off with the money in politics, right? The flood of money. My Senate race, for example, will be somewhere between 60, 80, $100 million, right? One Senate race. My first congressional race was $30 million. That was a 2-year term, right? Think of that. All the dark money, all the outside groups spending money. It's absurd what's happening. And we have to do more to rein in that money, to overturn Citizens United at a minimum, and get rid of all that outside money. More transparency. Another area that I think has to be addressed and looked at is the gerrymandering of the districts. Just to use quick round numbers here. About 20 years ago, when you looked at Congress, out of the 435 seats, about 200 of those were moderate seats. They could have been Republican, could have been Democrat, just depending on the year. Right? About 10 years ago, there were about 100 swing districts. Could have gone either way. This last Congress, there were about 45 competitive seats. right? So that's about 10% of the Congress is up for grabs. Therefore, 90% of the Congress is predetermined. It's going to be Republican or it's going to be Democrat. Right? And if you're one of those safe seats, what election matters? Your primary. How do you win a primary? Right? More to the right or more to the left? So there's very little incentive anymore for members of Congress to come back to the middle. In fact, they're more incentivized to go more to the extreme and not come together because of that gerrymandering. So we need fair districts, right? We've got to do more to get more moderate districts so people are incentivized to come to the middle. And we also must, and this is a tough one that's, I think, only becoming more serious, is look at the effects of media on politics. Right? 30 years ago, you get home from work, you turn on ABC, you see the news, whatever, but you go to bed. Here's what happened. Nowadays, you go to MSNBC or you go to Fox or you go to a website or an app that confirms your current beliefs. Admittedly so, I don't go to foxnews.com very often. I just don't, right? It makes me mad. I don't sleep at night. But we're all guilty, I think, in some ways of going to the, websites that confirm our current beliefs. So then what happens? Well, you all become a little bit more rigid. Oh, no, honey, see, you're wrong. Look, I see it right here. And every day you see it and you see it. Next thing you know, you become very partisan. And we're all becoming more guilty of this. So we've got to make sure that, especially for the students, that they are getting as much and as many independent sources of information so they can make a fair assessment. Right? And there's validity on all sides of the aisle for these arguments, but just make sure you're getting a balanced view of what's happening in the world, because so much of what we are reading and taking in nowadays has a partisan twist to it. So my promise to you all is the same as it was 5 years ago when I first started running for Congress. If elected to the Senate, I will continue to be an independent voice for the state of Florida. I will continue to make sure that every single piece of legislation I look at, everything I do is going to be, number one, to say, what's the impact of that on the state of Florida? What's the impact on the country? And then how's that sit inside? I take that same approach with everything, and will continue to make sure that I do what I think is best. Don't put on blinders and, listen to all the outside groups and all that, because I think we can make a difference. And call me naive, but this is a calling. And public service, despite all the negativity and all the nonsense, I believe is a place where we can make differences, right? Where we can give more opportunities to more people, right? And we have so much to offer as a nation, but we've got to come together and find that middle ground. So I thank you all for your support, and sure hope I win this election in 6 days. Thank you.
If you have questions for Congressman Murphy, please hold them up, and one of our volunteers will come by to pick it up. We're going to hear from the students from Jupiter High right now, so please take it away.
Good afternoon, Congressman Murphy. I'm Haley McGirt, co-president of the Jupiter High School Speech and Debate Team. My question for you today is, what do you believe is the greatest achievement in your political career, besides being elected, of course?
Well, thank you. I would start off probably with my work on the Everglades and the environment, whether that means working with my colleagues to help authorize $2 billion of funding for the Everglades, working to ensure that we get funding for C-44, C-43 giant water retention projects, passing legislation to help fund our estuary system. This was signed into law by the president. Overall looking at ways we can help clean up our water, look at our water infrastructure would probably be the greatest. But, there's a lot connected to that. With the environment and with our water woes come concerns and things we've been dealing with agriculture. I was able to pass legislation working with Congressman Rooney, Pat's brother, to help our citrus farmers, dealing with greening. Passing, legislation with other members of Congress to make sure that there are tax incentives out there to help these citrus farmers, replant after greening, helping them store more water, working to ensure that we pass legislation. I passed with Congressman Ross to help lower flood insurance rates for many Floridians. And I'd say the last thing was sort of what I closed with there on national security, was able to pass several provisions on the Intelligence Committee to help keep this country safe, whether that's cyber, whether that's our ports, or whether that's enforcing the deal with Iran. We'll continue to do everything I can to protect us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Congressman Murphy. I'm Daniela Gonzalez, co-president of the Jupiter High School Speech and Debate Team, and it's a pleasure to meet you. My question for you today is, as a member of the United Solutions Caucus, what methods have you employed with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle to move the economy forward?
Thank you. Well, starting off with that United Solutions Caucus, it was pretty clear we had a problem with the partisanship. It wasn't just the story I told about the elevator. It started off with leadership, basically keeping the two parties apart for the first several weeks. We go to this orientation. Imagine starting college, and they separated, two groups of people right off the bat. You got to get to know each other. And the more we got to know each other, the more we went out to dinner and, spent a little bit of time together, the more we realized, heck, we actually agreed on a lot more than we disagreed on. And why don't we start making some progress on the areas we agree on instead of disagree? And found that our economy, reducing our debt, investing more in our economy and education infrastructure was an area that we all actually agreed on. So one of the areas we first put forward was legislation called the SAVE Act. We identified $479 billion of wasteful, duplicative, fraudulent government spending. Looked at areas of efficiencies. So one example, say your family. You go to Costco to save money. You buy in bulk. Right? You save 10, 15% perhaps. Well, our federal government should have a central purchasing agency so they too buy in bulk. And you start saving 10, 15% on hundreds of billions of dollars of outlays, you're talking real money. So we're able to pass several provisions to help reduce that debt, make our government more efficient. But there's a lot more work, of course, to be done there with $19.2 trillion in debt and counting.
Thank you.
Thank you. So are we in a cyber war? And if it is with the Russians, what are we going to do to retaliate?
Yeah, I certainly think we have to be very careful. There's been a lot of talk in the media recently about a new Cold War building with Russia. And I think we have to be very careful with our rhetoric around this. And with cyber, it is a whole new world, right? I don't personally see another war where we are storming the beaches of Normandy. Right? Things are changing. And therefore, the investments we make in our military must also change, right? Whether that's in cyber, whether that's satellites and surveillance, whether that's special operations. Right? Be thinking not only about the war of today, but the war of tomorrow as well. And with cyber, it is such a unique war. I actually wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago calling for the federal government to start working with other countries to develop new rules of war, in essence. The same way we have rules of war around chemical and biological weapons, we should have it outlined very clearly to the rest of the world, whether it's a state actor or a non-state actor, to say, hey, if you hack us, if you come after our universities, if you come after our agencies, there will be consequences. We will track you down, and there shouldn't be gray area there. Because the world and many actors are acting in this way they don't know if we're going to respond and how we're going to respond. But it's come to the point now where I think we got to make it very clear. If you do this, there will be consequences. And we cannot continue to let countries or rogue actors, whether it's Russia, whether they're in Iran, whether they're in North Korea or China, you name it. We must invest more to make sure we are getting to the bottom of who's funding this. Because oftentimes what you're seeing is the state actors getting a little bit of distance, quietly funding, these operations that are hard to trace. And this is a vulnerability for us because as proud as we are and should be about our military, our submarines and our F-35s and all the brave men and women we have serving, it takes a much less investment in cyber to do some real damage to our country. So we better be ready for that and better make it very clear that we are going to respond, again, whether that's Russia or any other country.
Since the Iran deal has been passed, we've seen Iran making a lot of trouble for the United States over in the Middle East. What are we going to do about that?
Yeah. Iran has been a bad actor for years. Nothing new, this deal or not. They have been a bad actor in a country that couldn't be trusted. And I think it's important to note in that deal what exactly happened, where we were before and where we are today. Before that deal was signed, Iran was just weeks away from having a nuclear weapon, right? From having those abilities. Today, they are 1 year away. So we've moved that back a year, right? Been able, through that deal, to reduce their centrifuges by 2/3, reduce their enriched uranium by 98%. And there's nothing in this deal based on trust, right? Absolute verification, 24/7 monitoring. And we must make sure that we are continuing to crack down on Iran, on whatever bad activities they are participating in, whether that's human rights abuses, whether that's the funding of terrorism, by adding new sanctions on them, right? Working with our alliances, by working with other countries to bring them to their knees. The same way we did with that Iran deal, right? That got them to the negotiating table to actually make some serious sacrifices. Need to do that with everything else they're doing, whether that's in Syria, whether that's in other countries where we are finding that they are behind a lot of these bad actions. So let's ensure we are cracking down, doing more with these sanctions, but also, again, making sure that our greatest ally, Israel, has the resources she needs, to be ready for any threats Iran or any other country nearby poses to her.
So you talked about the election, and Gallup just came out with a report that 3 out of 10 Americans trust the government to do the right thing. A week from today, you're part of a new government. What do you do to restore that trust?
It's a great question. I think no matter what happens 7 days from now, we need to remind ourselves as Americans, first and foremost, not as Republicans and Democrats and independents, that all of this stuff is behind us. The election will be over in 7 days. It's about America, right? It's about this country. And I often fear that it's going to take a major event to remind America that it is about us. And I fear that after this divisive of an election and all the threats and all the things that have happened, that we're going to have more and more of the same finger pointing, more and more of the nonsense with very little vision to make the investments necessary to rebuild. And I hope whomever's elected president, I'm supporting Secretary Clinton, of course, believe and hope that she will be able to unite this country, bring the House and the Senate and the Republicans and Democrats together and say, at least let's try to make some major investments in education and infrastructure and national security. Let's find a couple really big areas to make sure we're making progress. And I think that with some new leadership, we're going to be able to do that. And I'm hopeful that both parties are able to stand up to some of the more extremes, to stand up and say, you know what, we're never going to make them happy. Let's find that middle ground. Let's get some big things done. And it's all about leadership. It's all about coming together to realize that and not having a House or a Senate or people saying, let's make sure, she's a one-term senator or, one-term president. Come on, we can't be playing politics every single day of our lives. We got to get over it, right? The election will be over soon. Let's come together as a country and say, all right, bygones, bygones. Let's look forward. Let's unite and start getting some things done.
In your remarks, you had mentioned the Affordable Care Act, and we saw a 25% increase in the silver plans. How do we stabilize it, and what do you think some of the improvements will look like in the plans?
Yeah, thank you. As I mentioned, there is very little, if any at all, legislation out of Washington, D.C. that doesn't need fixes. Right? And there were many things put into the Affordable Care Act, not that I was there, but the stories I've heard of deals that were made and things that happened to get that bill passed originally. Where they should have or not, I don't know. But it's very clear to everybody that we have to make changes. We have to get this thing right. Right? And it's not just for the small businesses. It's for long term. It's for our kids and grandkids. Because getting health care right is critical to our deficit. Right? We spend more than any other country by far on health care, and we actually have worse outcomes. Right? Think about that. That's been a trend for years. I think it's about $8,500 per individual. Yet we rank in the, 20s or 30s on outcomes? Right? Almost every other developed nation is somewhere around $2,000 a person. Right? We're like 2 standard deviations more expensive. Right? So we can do a lot more. And part of that, of course, is kind of rewinding and thinking about the healthcare system we have, what we had several years ago, and where we need to go. Where we're making sure, number one, that everybody has access to healthcare. I think we should be able to agree that everyone should have access to healthcare. But the system we have now, that we had before, I should say, said that you don't necessarily have that guarantee until you go to the emergency room. So then what happens with the hospitals? Start charging 10 times more for a basic procedure, and it ends up costing all of us a lot more money. So it inflates the cost for everybody. So if we're able to give everybody health care, make sure they're getting that basic checkup, that annual checkup, you will make sure that they're more healthy, but also make sure that we are catching diseases in stage 1 instead of stage 5, saving a lot of money. Making sure that we're helping to incentivize more Americans to live healthy lives. Whether that's stopping to, smoking, whether that's exercising, whether that's eating better, incentivizing them to do that, right? But making sure that we still keep the innovation, that we still keep the best, companies, whether that's a medical device manufacturer in this country, whether that's a new drug, doing what we can to make sure we have the best ideas here is important. We got to keep that balance. And I believe that by allowing the government to help negotiate with the pharmaceuticals, for example, we'll save billions and billions of dollars. Making sure we're expanding Medicaid to those 900,000 people in Florida, making sure they have that preventative treatment early on will actually save all of us a lot of money. Because what's happening now in Florida is we are paying extra taxes, right, for those 900,000 people to be covered. That money's going to D.C., but it ain't coming back. Right? Why in the world is that? Because of partisan politics in Tallahassee, right? Let's make sure that money comes back. We've already paid it. Right? Let's make sure people are getting that coverage. Let's move toward generics where we can, right? So there's a lot of things that we can do to make sure that people have coverage, but it's more affordable. And this is an area, I'll just real quick, as it relates to our deficit, a huge component of that long-term debt everyone reads about is healthcare. Healthcare costs historically has risen 12 to 14% as a country, way too high. Now, the first couple years after the Affordable Care Act passed, it was rising national health care around 4 to 5%. But now it's starting to spike because now we're starting to see some pent-up demand for health care services and a lot of people getting health care that didn't have it for years and years. So we have to make sure we can do what we can to flatten these cost curves and help bring down the price for insurance.
We're going to move to some local issues. The proposal to take 60,000 acres of farmland out of productive use in the Glades has small communities extremely concerned. How are they going to support themselves if that gets removed from the community?
Yes, well, I believe that we have to look at this holistically and believe that there are valid concerns of many of the farmers and many different groups, in South Florida and all of Florida that have to be balanced. But what we've seen is many of the folks south of the lake are actually moving north. We're seeing sugar, for example, moving north in many ways. I believe that we can find land to replace what they have, to make sure that they don't lose any jobs, but make sure ultimately that we're looking at the bigger picture here to help restore that natural flow of water south, to make sure that the Everglades is protected, that we don't continue to drown half the Everglades, that we don't continue, to dry out the other half, and make sure that ultimately we're making those steps forward. It's, of course, never an easy solution, but when Amendment 1 passed in Florida, right, 75% of voters agreed that we are willing to pay, and some of our tax money, willing for that to go toward land conservation and preservation, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars. They said $600 to $700 million was supposed to go to our environment. And where'd that money go? Squandered, right? Only 100 million or so has been spent on the environment. That's not what the voters wanted. Let's use that money to make these land purchases, to make sure that we're moving this water south, and at the same time, finding land for these farmers that might be displaced, that they have another place to go.
Presuming that you're a member of the Democratic majority in the Senate with Mrs. Clinton as president, what would be your legislative priority?
Yes, well, outlined a few here. I don't think we have 10 to 15 years to get a couple of these issues right that I mentioned. whether that's income inequality, whether that's climate change. Those are two issues to me that I don't think we have a long time to get right. We better get serious about it now. So when you look at what is behind and underlying a lot of our economic troubles, I think a lot of that leads back to education. So I think we better get very serious about investing in education, making sure that the children today and college kids have the same, if not more, opportunities than we had. And it's going to, of course, be tougher. But by ensuring we have the best education in the world, we will remain the world's top economy. We will remain the strongest. We just have to be willing to make those investments. So again, it's infrastructure, it's education. I believe we can and should be raising the minimum wage. I don't think anybody in this country willing to work a full-time job should be living in poverty. Right? So I think we should raise the minimum wage. And I think by doing that, we will only strengthen that middle class and help to rebuild it.
We've had a lot of questions about the national debt. Can you speak to us about the deficit spending and what we're going to do about the national debt?
Yep. So I think there's several components that have to be addressed if you're going to be serious about addressing our national debt. And this is something that a lot of folks went to D.C. talking about, but are not willing to make the necessary decisions to address it. Right? Over $19 trillion, as I mentioned, in debt right now. There's a couple components you got to look at. Number one is spending. Washington has a spending problem. We are very, very inefficient and have not adapted to the world of technology, have not made our agencies any more efficient. In fact, they've become less efficient. Right? Many of them are still using paper, to get things done. But we can do more to make it more efficient. I mentioned the SAVE Act earlier, that we found $479 billion in wasteful, duplicative, fraudulent government spending in a couple months. Imagine, you spend a couple years digging through to find all the waste we have in our country, in our government. So let's address the spending problem we have. Let's ensure that on the tax side, on the revenue side, that we are more efficient, that we're making sure everyone's paying their fair share. Right? There was a study that showed the average Fortune 500 tax rate was an effective rate of somewhere around 10, 12%. Right? The effective rate. Right, for some of the largest corporations in the world. But think about what the small businesses are paying. Right? The mom and pops, many of which are probably here in this room today. They're paying a lot more than that. Right? So let's revisit our tax code. Let's have comprehensive tax reform to make sure everyone's paying their fair share, actually reducing tax rates, but getting rid of some of those loopholes and deductions. And third, and perhaps most importantly, let's grow our economy. Right? We cannot and should not get used to 2.5%, 3% GDP growth. Right? We've got to expand that. We've got to do more. And what's the best way to do that? Right? In my opinion, the best way to do that is create an environment where there's certainty and predictability. Right? So if you do want to invest in a new factory, if you do want to buy a new fleet of cars, build a new business, whatever it might be, you probably want to know what your tax rates are going to be next year and in 5 years from now. Right? What your depreciation tables are going to be. You want to know what your regulatory environment is going to look like, what interest rates are going to be. You want these sort of basic parameters. And you want the government to get the heck out of the way. But think about what we've done in Washington the past several years. Government shutdowns, fiscal cliffs, sequesters. We've done the complete opposite. We've injected more uncertainty into your lives than certainty. So I believe that it is the partisanship in Washington, D.C. that is actually holding back our country and holding back our ability to reduce that long-term debt.
This is our last question. What is the kindest thing that anyone has done for you in your political career?
The kindest thing, the nicest thing somebody's done. There have been quite a few folks that have gone out on a limb to endorse me very early on, that have gone out to put their necks out, that believed in me. Many folks in this room believed in me early on in my first race, whether they thought I was going to win against Allen West or not. They were there willing to help me out. And it's not necessarily just the folks writing checks. It's the folks that come into my office every single day, every single weekend, right, that make phone calls, right, that stuff envelopes, that go out and knock on doors, right, the seniors that come into my office, many of which are living check to check and coming in to help give back a little bit of their time to make sure that there are more opportunities for their kids and grandkids because they believe in our country. And we've gotten so caught up in this partisan nonsense that I think many people have lost sight of what politics is all about and what public service is all about. So it's the people that have gone above and beyond to help me out, because it's teamwork, right? Anybody in public service at any level, I think, would tell you need a good team. You need people that believe in you, that are there willing to help you out in any way. So for all of those that have done that, thank you very much. Thank you.
Congressman, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next luncheon.